Look at this map of Australia. For decades, the national conversation about economic growth has been crushed under a single, highly restrictive accounting ledger. When economic growth slows, public debate circles back to a familiar diagnosis. We are told the nation is suffering from a productivity stagnation. The mainstream explanation for this stagnation points to the workforce. Orthodox policy suggests we are dealing with a worker effort problem, a lack of discipline, or an excess of regulatory red tape. But the source of this stagnation is a structural allocation problem, a mismatch between where the nation's talent and capital are flowing and where they are actually required to build a productive economy. This mismatch is driven by a specific policy fiction, the belief that the Commonwealth of Australia is financially constrained in the exact same way a household is. By framing sovereign national spending through the lens of household debt optics and fiscal balance, governments artificially narrow their policy ambition. They treat essential enabling systems as costs to be minimized rather than capacities to be built. This split-screen model illustrates the difference between a currency user and a currency issuer. On the left, a household operates as a currency user, requiring Australian dollars before spending. On the right, the Commonwealth government originates the currency it spends. Because the Commonwealth issues the currency, it cannot face a strictly financial capital constraint in its own fiat currency. The question is never where the money will come from. The actual constraints that bind a currency issuer are physical. They are the real limits of labor availability, material supply chains, energy grids, and ecological room. When a government attempts to push spending past that physical wall of real capacity, it generates inflationary bottlenecks. The limit is productive capacity, not the balance of a bank account. Treating a sovereign government like a household is a fiat fallacy. It leads governments to minimize essential enabling infrastructure as a fiscal cost, rather than building it as a necessary productive capacity. This Sankey diagram maps resource flows, revealing severe structural misallocation. Sectors with national resilience, like engineering and infrastructure, are starved of critical resources. Instead, labor and savings flood upward, absorbed entirely by financial churn, property speculation, and systems trading claims over existing wealth. A healthy financial system is necessary for commerce, but an oversized financial sector acts as a direct drag on national productivity. It absorbs the nation's top talent and most sophisticated systems, dedicating them to fee stacking and transaction intermediation rather than engineering or research. Consider how this plays out in housing. Public policy has treated housing primarily as an asset class rather than as enabling infrastructure. This crowds out productive investment and impairs labor mobility. When housing near employment centers becomes prohibitively expensive, downstream effects hit the real economy. Recruitment becomes harder, and commuting burdens rise. The disposable income needed to support small business formation is swallowed by rising rents. Financialization and property churn generate massive amounts of measured transactional activity. Yet, as the volume of these transactions grows, the nation's foundational resilience and ability to actually produce goods actively degrades. A similar degradation occurs through the marketization of public assets. The orthodox justification asserts that private ownership inherently sharpens incentives, cuts waste, and encourages innovation. That theory breaks down when applied to natural monopolies like electricity grids. A unified public utility fractures, and gaps are filled by private toll points. This newly fragmented system issues more invoices, artificially inflating GDP metrics, even as real efficiency per hour worked steadily drops. Economists call this service drift, the transition toward a thinner productive base that relies on a much thicker intermediary layer to function. A service-rich economy is healthy when it focuses on socially necessary functions like health, education, and care. The drag occurs when those resources are diverted into rent-extracting intermediation and the monetization of administrative complexity. Replacing a public utility with a network of private toll points does not create competitive efficiency. It merely reclassifies administrative friction and user costs as economic growth. The most damaging consequence of the false household budget constraint is found in how orthodox policy treats the labor market. This grid represents the national labor force. Current policy manages inflation through a concept called NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It is a macroeconomic framework that actively uses a designated rate of joblessness as a stabilization device. The logic is to seek national price stability by deliberately enforcing a buffer stock of people without work to suppress overall economic demand. This method represents a direct economic failure. Every unemployed person represents lost output and diminished future capacity. It also triggers hysteresis, the permanent skill loss occurring when workers are left idle. The labor capacity simply decays. Using unemployment to control inflation is economically wasteful. It imposes the burden of macroeconomic adjustment on those least able to bear it, while permanently decaying the nation's productive human capital. An alternative model exists that addresses inflation without the waste of the Nehru framework. It replaces the buffer stock of unemployment with a buffer stock of employment. A job guarantee is federally funded by the currency issuer, but locally administered to target regional needs. Idle labor connects to socially useful public work. Acting as an automatic fiscal stabilizer, it expands when private demand weakens and seamlessly contracts when private demand strengthens. This maintains work habits, provides basic accreditation, sustains regional incomes, and stops the decay of hysteresis entirely. An economy cannot credibly claim to be pursuing high productivity while maintaining policy frameworks that systematically leave its available labor force idle. Australia must abandon the idea that labor market slack is a policy virtue. The objective should be a high-pressure economy where employers are forced to compete for labor and training systems respond to immediate need. Operating a high-pressure economy requires rebuilding the public capability and planning institutions that have been steadily eroded over the last few decades. First, the fragmented, privatized employment network should be replaced with a modern, public national employment service. It needs deep data capabilities to provide forward-looking labor market intelligence and accurately match workers to regional vacancies. Second, the nation requires a standing works pipeline, a rolling, costed queue of regional public infrastructure projects that are fully approved and ready to deploy the exact moment private demand falters. Third, basic banking access, cash distribution networks, and low-cost payment rails must be treated as essential economic infrastructure, particularly for regional communities, rather than operating strictly as private profit centers. Finally, in sectors facing chronic shortages like health, construction, and energy, the public sector must actively build upstream capacity. Throwing nominal funding at thin markets produces bidding wars. True capacity requires physical training places, supervisory staff, and regional relocation accommodation. Productivity does not emerge spontaneously from market signals alone. It depends on deliberate planning, localized information, and highly capable public institutions. We also need to change how we measure success. Current productivity metrics often rely on a simplistic assumption that non-market sectors with difficult output measurements are inherently low productivity. This ignores the massive economic contribution of activity outside formal market exchange. Unpaid domestic work, community volunteering, and informal care sustain households and reproduce the workforce that makes market production possible. Ignoring these non-monetary activities distorts policy analysis. It leads governments to mistake the shifting of costs and risks onto families and unpaid workers as an efficiency gain in the formal statistics. Accurate measurement must distinguish between activity that raises real social capacity and activity that merely increases monetary turnover. National productivity policy is an exercise in real resource management. It is about matching actual labor to actual materials to produce socially useful output without generating inflation. Until we reject the language of artificial financial constraint, we will remain trapped in a cycle of deferred investment, tolerated underemployment, and institutional drift. The government is not a household. Its limits are physical, not financial. Shifting our focus away from fiscal optics and toward real capacity building is the only way to mobilize idle resources, eliminate extractive rents, and engineer a truly resilient Australia.